The lab hummed with the sound of filtered air. Sophie stood at the center of the room, surrounded by rows of glass and steel that caught the harsh overhead light. She did not look at the monitors or the data scrolling across the screens. Her attention was anchored to the object in her hand. It was a crystal vial, heavy and cool against her palm. She closed her eyes, shutting out the clinical glare of the workspace. Her fingers moved slowly, tracing the curve of the glass, feeling the subtle vibrations of the liquid trapped within. This was the result of 3 years of isolation. The Immortal Rose. She held it up, watching the light refract through the amber depths of the mixture. It was perfectly still. She reached for the dropper, her hand steady, her movements precise. The room seemed to hold its breath. She held the dropper suspended. A single, clear bead of liquid clung to the glass tip, trembling under the weight of its own surface tension. Sophie did not blink. She lowered the tip until the bead touched the amber surface of the mixture. It did not sink immediately. It sat on the surface like a diamond, refracting the harsh light of the lab. Then, with a microscopic shudder, the drop broke through. It spiraled downward, leaving a thin, translucent trail that dissolved into the depths. The reaction was instantaneous. The liquid in the vial began to churn, swirling in a tight, rhythmic vortex that defied the stillness of the room. Sophie watched as the amber color shifted, deepening into a vibrant, living crimson. Then, the scent hit. It was not a perfume. It was an atmosphere. It flooded the sterile space, heavy with the essence of 1,000 crushed petals, sharp, sweet, and overwhelming. The clinical smell of ozone and antiseptic vanished. Sophie inhaled, her chest rising as the scent filled her lungs. She set the dropper down on the metal tray with a sharp click. The masterpiece was complete. The silence of the lab was shattered by the heavy thud of the pneumatic door sliding open. Sophie did not turn. She kept her eyes fixed on the vial, her hands still resting on the cold metal of the workbench. A sharp, rhythmic clicking of heels echoed against the linoleum floor, moving with a deliberate, aggressive pace. Victor stepped into the light. He did not glance at the equipment, nor did he acknowledge the woman standing at the center of the room. He walked straight to the wall-mounted mirror near the ventilation intake. He stopped, his movements sudden and calculated. He reached up, his fingers working with practiced speed to straighten his neckwear, pulling the fabric until it sat with geometric precision. He checked his jawline, turning his head left and right, his expression shifting into a rehearsed, confident smirk. He was a man, performing for an audience that was not there. He pivoted on his heel, his posture rigid, and strode toward the workbench. Victor did not wait for an invitation. His hand shot out, fingers closing around the crystal vial with a sharp, metallic clink. He ripped it from the workbench, the sudden motion causing the liquid inside to splash against the glass. He held the vial up to the overhead lights, watching the crimson fluid catch the glare. He did not look at the woman standing beside him. He looked only at his own reflection in the glass, his eyes bright with a predatory hunger. "My name," he whispered, his voice smooth and cold. He turned the vial, admiring the way the light fractured through the liquid. "My face, my talent." He spoke the words as if they were a divine decree. He tucked the vial into his palm, his grip tightening until his knuckles turned white. He was not just taking a formula, he was claiming the years of labor. He stood there, basking in the glow of his own perceived brilliance, his chest puffed out, his gaze fixed on the prize he had just stolen. He turned the vial once more, a thin, satisfied smile spreading across his face, completely convinced that the genius in his hand was his own invention. Victor did not pause to let the words settle. He turned toward the door, his voice sharp and dismissive. "You are finished here. Clear your station by the hour." He did not wait for a response or protest. He strode toward the exit, his footsteps echoing with a hollow, arrogant rhythm. Sophie remained standing at the workbench. She did not blink. She did not look at him. The silence in the room deepened, heavy and thick. She reached for her canvas bag, her movements slow, deliberate, and precise. She began to clear the desk, one item at a time. She placed her calipers into the side pocket, then her notebook, her fingers steady as she smoothed the pages. She picked up a small, unmarked beaker, her grip firm. She set it down on the edge of the desk, right where he would reach for his notes. She zipped the bag and walked toward the door. She did not look back. She left the room, save for the single, unstable variable. Sophie stopped at the edge of the desk, her shadow stretching long across the sterile floor. She reached into a pocket, pulling out a small, glass vial filled with a clear, viscous liquid. It was not part of the original project. It was something else entirely. She set the vial down with surgical precision, aligning it perfectly with the corner of the mahogany blotter. She nudged it forward, just a fraction of an inch, until it sat exactly where his hand would land when he reached for his ledger. The liquid inside the vial swirled, a faint, iridescent film clinging to the glass walls. It looked harmless, almost like water, but the chemical bond was fragile. She took a final look at the room, the rows of equipment, and the empty space where her work had been. She turned, her boots clicking, and walked toward the exit without a backward glance. The door swung shut behind her with a soft, final thud. The atmosphere shifted completely. The sterile white of the laboratory dissolved into a cavernous hall, draped in deep purple and gold. Light bounced off crystal chandeliers, casting long, flickering shadows across the polished marble floor. Investors moved in tight clusters, their voices rising in a rhythmic, expectant hum. Every guest held a glass, the liquid inside catching the amber glow of the room. Celebrities stood near the center, their heads turning in unison toward the stage, scanning for the arrival of the main attraction. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the static tension of money waiting to be made. A string quartet played in the corner, their music weaving through the chatter, fast and precise. People leaned in toward one another, whispering, their eyes darting toward the empty podium. The crowd was a sea of movement, a collective pulse of greed and curiosity. They were not here for the music or the wine. They were here for the promise of the scent. Every person in the room held their breath, waiting for the moment the product would finally be revealed. The hall felt like a pressurized chamber, ready to snap at the slightest provocation. The stage remained empty, but the focus was absolute. The anticipation was a physical weight. The chatter died out as the side curtain pulled back. Victor stepped into the light. He did not walk. He glided, his stride measured to maximize the impact of his arrival. The spotlight caught him, washing out the surrounding shadows and turning the stage into a solitary island of brilliance. He stopped exactly at the center, feet planted wide, chin tilted just enough to catch the glare of the overhead lamps. He waited. He let the silence stretch, forcing the room to acknowledge his presence. Only when the tension reached its peak did he raise his right hand. Between his thumb and forefinger, he held the vial. It caught the light, refracting the gold and purple of the hall. He turned slowly, presenting the object to the left, then the right, like a relic of immense value. His expression remained fixed. He held the bottle high, his arm locked, displaying the formula as the pinnacle of his achievement. The crowd watched, mesmerized. Victor gripped the base of the crystal vial, his thumb pressing firmly against the seal. He did not rush. He took a breath, letting the silence of the room amplify the sound of his own heartbeat. With a sudden, sharp motion, he twisted the cap. The seal broke with a crisp, audible click that echoed against the high ceilings. He held the nozzle steady, aiming it toward the center of the hall. He squeezed. A fine, pressurized mist erupted from the glass, catching the intense glare of the stage lights. It did not dissipate into the air. Instead, it hung suspended, a shimmering cloud of glittering gold dust that drifted slowly across the stage. The particles caught the light, refracting into 1,000 brilliant sparks that danced in the stagnant air. The mist expanded, swirling in the wake of the ventilation currents, glowing with an unnatural, metallic luster. It moved outward, a golden veil descending upon the front rows. The guests leaned forward, their faces illuminated by the floating dust. Victor stood motionless, his arms still extended, watching the gold dust settle onto the shoulders and hair of the wealthy crowd. The air grew dense with the shimmer. The silence of the room was broken by the first note of the string quartet. It was a sophisticated, rhythmic melody, sharp and precise, vibrating against the polished wood of the stage. The music wove through the golden haze, dictating the pace of the evening. Guests shifted in their seats, their attention pulled from the shimmering dust to the sound of the violins. As the tempo increased, a collective impulse rippled through the hall. One by one, the investors and celebrities leaned into the air. They inhaled deeply, drawing the golden particles into their lungs. The effect was instantaneous. Eyes widened, reflecting the artificial brilliance of the room. A woman in the front row parted her lips, her gaze locked on the empty space where the mist hung thickest. Beside her, a man closed his eyes, his head tilting back as if savoring a vintage wine. The air felt heavy, saturated with the promise of the scent. Every face in the crowd softened, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated delight. The quartet pushed the melody higher, a crescendo of strings that mirrored the growing intoxication of the room. The guests remained motionless, caught in the grip of the fragrance. Victor watched the room with the calculated stillness of a predator. He saw the way the investors leaned forward, the way their breathing synchronized with the rhythm of the strings. He did not move for a long moment, letting the silence of his own confidence anchor the scene. Then, he stepped toward the edge of the stage. He brought his hand up, his fingers grazing the bridge of his nose in a slow, deliberate motion. He inhaled, his chest expanding with a theatrical flourish, his eyes half closed as if the scent were a physical weight he could hold and shape. He turned his head, scanning the front rows, and offered a faint, knowing smile to the most influential faces in the hall. It was a gesture of shared intimacy, a silent promise that they were the only ones capable of understanding such perfection. He nodded once, a sharp, authoritative dip of his chin. The atmosphere in the hall began to change, not with a sound, but with a slow, creeping weight. The air, previously crisp and light, grew dense. A subtle, unnatural warmth began to radiate from the center of the room, spreading outward like a slow-moving tide. It started as a faint prickle against the skin of the guests. A man in the third row shifted his weight, pulling at his collar with a thumb. Beside him, a woman wiped a bead of moisture from her temple, her eyes flickering away from the stage. The heat was not coming from the lights. It was emanating from the floor, rising up through the soles of their feet. It was a dry, insistent warmth that made the air feel thin. Victor remained on stage, his expression fixed in a mask of triumph, oblivious to the change. But the crowd was beginning to react. The rhythmic swaying of the guests slowed, shoulders tensed. The air felt increasingly stifling, as if the oxygen were being replaced by something heavier, something that clung to the skin. A low, restless murmur began to replace the sharp precision of the string quartet. The guests were no longer leaning forward in delight. They were shifting in their seats, their movements becoming jagged and erratic. The heat was no longer a suggestion. It was a physical pressure. The air inside the hall began to distort. The fine golden mist that had been drifting gracefully through the light beams suddenly stalled. It hung suspended for a heartbeat, then began to vibrate with a frantic, erratic energy. The particles were no longer drifting. They were colliding. Each speck of gold seemed to seek out another, merging into larger, heavier clusters that defied the gentle currents of the room. A faint, high-pitched hum vibrated through the floorboards, barely audible beneath the music. The guests watched, frozen, as the mist thickened. It was no longer a translucent haze. It was becoming a dense, swirling suspension of matter. The golden glow began to lose its luster, turning dull and opaque. The air grew thick enough to see, a swirling vortex of particles that refused to dissipate. A woman reached out, her hand passing through a cloud of the mist, and she pulled back as if she had touched something oily. The mist was clumping, turning into tiny, visible droplets that hung in the air like suspended grit. The reaction was no longer silent. A faint, crackling sound emerged. The golden haze was dying, replaced by a heavy, agitated mass that churned with a life of its own. The final transition happened in a heartbeat. The vibrant, golden luster that had defined the air vanished, bleached away by a rapid, internal chemical collapse. Where there had been a shimmering haze, there was now a heavy, gray vapor. It hung in the rafters like a low-slung storm cloud, thick and suffocating. The particles had lost their buoyancy, clumping into dense, leaden droplets that swirled in lazy, ominous circles. The light from the overhead chandeliers struggled to penetrate the mass, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. This was no longer a perfume. It was a physical weight, a gray blanket settling over the room. The vapor began to sink, curling downward in tendrils. It moved with a deliberate, predatory slowness, ignoring the ventilation currents that usually kept the air clear. Above the heads of the elite, the gray mass churned, a silent, swirling vortex that seemed to pulse with its own internal pressure. The transformation was complete, and the weight of it was now inescapable. The string quartet remained oblivious at first, their bows moving in perfect, rhythmic synchronization. They played a sophisticated, light-hearted melody that filled the hall with artificial elegance. Then, the first note faltered. The lead violinist pressed his finger down, but the string produced a flat, jarring vibration that cut through the harmony. He paused, his brow furrowing, and tried to correct the pitch. The rest of the group stumbled, their timing slipping, as the air around them grew dense. What had been a smooth, flowing composition began to warp. The intervals between the notes stretched, turning the melody into something jagged. The cello emitted a low, grinding groan that resonated against the floorboards, clashing violently with the frantic screech of the violins. The rhythm fractured, collapsing into a series of sour, dissonant chords. The musicians stopped playing, their instruments held midair. The harmony had been completely erased, replaced by an unsettling, discordant hum that mirrored the unseen corruption spreading. The final, sour note of the violin hung in the air for a second before vanishing into the silence. With the music gone, the room became unnervingly quiet. Then, the transformation of the air reached its peak. The divine, intoxicating scent of roses that had permeated the hall for the last hour simply ceased to exist. It did not fade. It was deleted. One moment, the air was heavy with the perfume of a summer garden, and the next, it was completely sterile. The sudden absence of the floral notes created a vacuum that felt like a physical pressure against the senses. Guests who had been inhaling deeply to catch the fragrance found themselves pulling in nothing but thin, flavorless air. A man near the center of the room paused, his hand halfway to his nose, his expression shifting from delight to bewilderment. He blinked, sniffing again, searching for the ghost of the scent, but found only emptiness. Around him, others stopped their conversations, their heads tilting in synchronized confusion. The silence of the scent was absolute, a hollow space that left everyone standing in a state of sudden, uneasy anticipation. The silence of the scent lasted only a heartbeat. Then, the air in the hall underwent a violent, chemical mutation. It started as a faint, metallic tang that prickled the back of the throat, a warning sign that went ignored in the stillness. Without warning, the atmosphere shattered. A thick, pungent wave of industrial waste and raw sulfur surged through the room. It was not a subtle smell. It was a physical blow. The odor arrived with the force of a landslide, heavy and suffocating, instantly displacing the clean air. It carried the sharp, biting sting of chemical runoff and the deep, rot-like stench of stagnant, polluted water. The molecules seemed to cling to the skin, thick and oily. It was an undeniable, aggressive assault on the senses that left no room for doubt. The smell did not just enter the room, it conquered it, filling every corner and crevice with the suffocating weight of industrial decay. The transition from nothingness to this overwhelming, foul presence was instantaneous, leaving the entire room trapped in a sudden, suffocating cloud of chemical rot. The air was no longer just a medium for sound. It was a carrier of poison. In the front row, a woman stood frozen, her eyes wide and fixed on the stage. The stench hit her with such concentrated force that her body rebelled before her mind could process the cause. Her throat constricted, a sharp, involuntary spasm that forced her head to jerk forward. She raised both hands, pressing her palms hard against her mouth and nose, trying to seal out the suffocating fumes. Her shoulders hunched, her frame trembling as she gagged again. A deep, hacking sound that tore through the sudden quiet of the hall. She stumbled back, her heels catching on the carpet, her face pale and twisted in genuine, unadulterated horror. She was the first to break, but she would not be the last. The odor was a physical weight that pushed against her, making every breath a struggle against the urge to retch. She looked around, searching for a way out, her eyes watering from the chemical sting. The reality of the rot had fully registered, turning her initial curiosity into a desperate, frantic need to escape the space. She leaned over, gasping for air that did not exist, her hands still clamped over her face, her entire posture screaming of the violation. The contagion of disgust moved through the front rows like a shockwave. Beside the woman, a man tightened his grip on his champagne flute, his knuckles turning white as he fought the urge to follow her lead. Then, his resolve snapped. His fingers went slack. The crystal glass slipped from his hand, hitting the marble floor with a sharp, crystalline crack that echoed through the hall. It was the signal for the rest. One by one, the investors surrendered to the overwhelming assault on their senses. A second glass fell, then a third, the sound of shattering crystal becoming a rhythmic, frantic percussion beneath the rising murmur of the crowd. Liquid splashed across the floor, mixing with the heavy, sulfurous air. Men and women stood paralyzed, their hands trembling, the expensive stems of their glasses clattering against the stone as they let go. The sound of the breaking glass was sharp and final, a stark contrast to the thick, suffocating rot that filled the room. No one moved to pick them up. No one cared about the loss. The sound of breaking glass was the final tether to decorum, and it snapped. A collective gasp rippled through the hall, but it was cut short by the realization that the air itself had become an enemy. The scent was no longer just a nuisance. It was a heavy, suffocating weight that burned the back of every throat. People began to stumble, their movements uncoordinated and frantic. The orderly rows of chairs were overturned as guests surged to their feet, the sound of wood scraping against stone adding to the rising din. A man near the center of the hall collapsed to his knees, his hands clawing at his chest as he struggled to find a pocket of clean oxygen. Behind him, the crowd surged forward, a tidal wave of bodies pushing and colliding in the dim light. The atmosphere was thick with the smell of sulfur and the sharp, metallic tang of fear. Conversations died instantly, replaced by the sound of heavy, ragged breathing and the frantic scuffling of feet on the polished floor. The hall, once a place of sophisticated silence, was now a pressure cooker of raw, unfiltered panic. Every person in the room was now locked in the same desperate struggle, their eyes wide and darting, searching for a way to escape the invisible poison that had turned their evening into a nightmare. The chaos was absolute. The surge toward the exits became a frantic, unthinking stampede. Guests clawed at their pockets, pulling out silk squares and linen napkins, pressing them firmly against their noses and mouths to filter the burning air. The fabric offered little protection against the pervasive stench, but they held it tight, knuckles white and trembling. Near the main doors, the movement stalled. A bottleneck formed as dozens of bodies collided, pushing and shoving in a desperate bid to reach the threshold. Shoulders slammed into shoulders, elbows dug into ribs. There was no room for courtesy, only the raw, kinetic energy of survival. A woman stumbled, her handkerchief slipping, and she let out a sharp, choked cry before being swept forward by the press of the crowd. The sound of scuffling feet was deafening, a rhythmic scraping against the floor that drowned out the distant, discordant notes of the quartet. They moved as a single, panicked organism, driven by the singular need to breach the doors and reach the open air beyond. The stampede thinned until the hall was hollow, leaving behind only the discarded remnants of a gala. Chairs lay toppled in jagged rows, and discarded napkins littered the floor like fallen leaves. Yet, on the raised platform, the movement did not cease. Victor remained exactly where he had stood when the first note of the quartet soured. He held his hands out, palms upturned, as if expecting the applause of 1,000 people. His head tilted slightly to the side, a gesture of practiced grace that now played out to an empty room. He inhaled deeply, his chest expanding with a rhythmic, steady cadence, completely untouched by the sulfurous rot that clung to the walls. He did not notice the silence that had replaced the music. He did not notice the heavy, gray vapor that swirled around his feet like a rising tide. He stood as a sole anchor in a sea of abandonment, performing for a ghost audience that had long since retreated from the rot of his own making. Victor began to pace the stage, his steps deliberate and measured. He walked from the left edge to the right, stopping periodically to offer a slight, gracious bow to the empty air. He interpreted the total silence of the hall as a sign of profound impact, a testament to the power of his creation. He stopped at the center microphone, his fingers gripping the cold metal stand. He leaned in, his breath hitching as he inhaled again, pulling the thick, sulfurous air deep into his lungs. He did not choke, he did not recoil. Instead, his face smoothed into a look of serene satisfaction. He closed his eyes, savoring the invisible scent he believed to be the pinnacle of his work. He moved his hands in slow, sweeping arcs, conducting an imaginary orchestra that no longer played. He felt the weight of the spotlight, convinced that every eye in the city was fixed upon him. He stood tall, chest puffed out, drinking in the rot as if it were the finest perfume. He stood motionless for a long moment, his smile widening, completely surrendered to the hallucination of his own triumph. The last of the guests did not leave. They fled. The heavy double doors at the rear of the hall groaned as they were shoved open, colliding against the stone walls with a dull, echoing thud. Footsteps hammered against the marble floor, a frantic rhythm that grew fainter until it was swallowed by the night outside. Behind them, the room was a landscape of sudden, violent departure. Crystal glasses lay shattered near the base of the stage, their contents pooling into sticky, dark stains. Chairs were overturned, their legs pointing toward the ceiling like broken limbs. A discarded tray slid across the floor, coming to a rest against a pillar. The air in the hall grew heavy, thick, with the scent of sulfur that now dominated every corner. Dust motes danced in the spotlight, illuminated in the stagnant, gray vapor. Where there had been movement and life, there was now only the stillness of a tomb. The silence was absolute, punctuated only by the distant, muffled sound of the city. Every exit was now wide open, framing the darkness outside, while the interior remained trapped in the suffocating, pungent rot of the failed experiment. The silence that followed the exodus was not empty. It was heavy, pressing against the walls like a physical weight. Victor remained on the stage, his presence the only anomaly in the vast, vacant expanse. The spotlights continued to burn, casting his shadow long and thin across the rows of abandoned, overturned seating. He turned slowly, his boots clicking against the polished wood of the platform, the sound echoing into the rafters. He looked toward the rear of the hall, where the open doors revealed only a sliver of the dark street outside. There were no voices, no applause. He walked to the edge of the stage and peered down into the darkness of the front rows, where napkins and broken glass lay scattered in the gloom. He reached out, his hand hovering in the air, as if to grasp the attention of a ghost. The air in the room remained stagnant. He stood at the center of the stage, a solitary figure framed by the harsh, artificial light. He was the sole inhabitant of a grand, ruined theater. The gray vapor did not merely drift. It clung. It pooled around the base of the stage, rising like a tide of stagnant water. Victor took a step forward, his boot dragging through the thick, swirling haze that now obscured the floorboards beneath him. He looked down, but the light from the overhead lamps caught the particles, scattering them into a blinding, opaque wall of gray. He reached out, his fingers parting the heavy air, feeling a strange, oily resistance against his skin. The vapor swirled in his wake, closing back in behind him, as if the room were trying to swallow his presence entirely. He stood motionless, his posture rigid, while the fog curled around his ankles and climbed toward his knees. It was a physical weight, a dense, suffocating blanket that turned the stage into an island of isolation. He shifted his weight, and the floor groaned. He was the anchor of this decay, a man standing in the center of a storm he had created but could not see. The ventilation system overhead groaned, a metallic rattle that vibrated through the stage floor. A sudden gust of air, forced through the vents, caught the dense gray vapor and shoved it violently toward the center of the platform. Victor did not see it coming. He was still staring into the empty hall, his expression fixed in a practiced, vacant smile. The cloud hit him like a physical blow, wrapping around his head and forcing its way into his nostrils. He inhaled, expecting the familiar, manufactured floral notes. Instead, the air turned sharp, acidic, and vile. The scent of sulfur and rotting waste flooded his lungs, instantaneous and overwhelming. His breath hitched, turning into a sharp, involuntary gasp. The smile, held in place for so long, twitched and then disintegrated. His eyes widened, darting toward the empty seats, as if searching for a source. He clutched his throat, his fingers digging into his own skin. He coughed, a dry, hacking sound. The reality of the room finally broke through his denial, and he stood, frozen, his chest heaving. The air burned. Victor clawed at his collar, his movements frantic and uncoordinated. He looked down at the vial, still gripped in his shaking hand, the glass slick with a dark, oily residue that had leaked from the stopper. It was not the golden mist he had promised the world. It was a thick, black sludge. He wiped his thumb against his palm, but the substance smeared. The smell intensified, a nauseating cocktail of chemical decay that seemed to seep directly into his pores. He looked out at the empty, silent hall, his gaze finally focusing on the wreckage of his presentation. Every detail of his success was dissolving. He realized then that the foundation of his entire career was built on this volatile, corrosive waste. He tried to speak, but only a wet, hacking cough escaped his lips. His knees buckled, the weight of his own deception pressing down on him. He stood in the center of the stage, a man surrounded by the physical manifestation of his own ruin, watching as the last of his reputation evaporated. Outside the grand hall, the evening air was cool and still. Shadows stretched long across the pavement, reaching toward the heavy, ornate doors that muffled the chaos within. Sophie stood near the edge of the fountain, her posture relaxed, her gaze fixed on the flickering light bleeding through the high windows. She did not move. She did not look away. She watched the way the building seemed to pulse with the internal distress of the guests fleeing the lobby. The pressure in the air was palpable, a static charge that made the hair on her arm stand up. She checked her watch, the second hand ticking with rhythmic precision. Inside, the chemical reaction was no longer a contained event. It was a living, breathing entity, consuming the prestige Victor had fought so hard to cultivate. She took a slow, steady breath, savoring the crisp night air, a sharp contrast to the sulfurous decay she knew was currently saturating the ballroom. Every muffled shout, and the frantic clatter of heels against marble served as a countdown. The architect of this ruin stood in the dark, perfectly composed, waiting for the final collapse. She knew the structural integrity of his lies was failing. The foundation was gone. The weight of his own hubris was finally beginning to crush the stage beneath him. Inside the ballroom, the air had become a physical weight. The gray vapor did not merely drift, it pulsed. It expanded and contracted in a rhythmic, sickening cycle that mirrored the erratic flickering of the overhead chandeliers. Every time the vapor surged, the scent of sulfur intensified, coating the velvet curtains and the gilded trim in a fine, corrosive film. The stage, once the centerpiece of Victor's vanity, now groaned under the chemical assault. The wood warped, the finish bubbling. Victor stood motionless, his lungs straining against the heavy, toxic atmosphere. Yet he remained trapped in his own sensory delusion. He reached out to steady himself against the podium, but his fingers slipped on the slick, oily surface. The vapor swirled around his ankles. High above, the ventilation system rattled, struggling to push the dense, gray mass out of the room. But the air was too heavy to move. The room was no longer a place of celebration. It was a pressurized chamber of decay. The final, catastrophic peak was only a breath away. The last of the guests vanished through the heavy mahogany doors, their frantic footsteps fading into the distance. The ballroom fell into a sudden, jarring stillness. Only the low, rhythmic hum of the ventilation system remained, struggling against the thick, gray residue clinging to the walls. Victor stood alone on the stage, his hands still raised, fingers curled, as if he was still holding the attention of 1,000 people. He opened his mouth to deliver his closing remarks, but the sound died in his throat. He blinked, his eyes darting across the rows of overturned chairs and discarded glasses. The gold-leafed floor was littered with abandoned programs and shattered crystal. He turned slowly, scanning the shadows of the balcony, searching for a single face, a single sign of life. There was nothing. The vast, cavernous hall had become a tomb of his own making. A bead of sweat traced a path down his temple, cutting through the grime on his skin. He took a sharp, shallow breath, his chest heaving, and finally, the performance stopped. He froze. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. The silence in the ballroom was not merely an absence of sound. It was a physical pressure that pushed against his eardrums. Victor stood on the stage, his gaze fixed on the empty rows of chairs. He tried to shift his weight, but his legs felt leaden, as if the very air had turned to sludge. He took one step forward, the wood of the stage creaking under his boot, a sound so sharp it echoed like a gunshot in the cavernous space. He stopped again, his breath hitching. The gray vapor clung to the rafters, swirling in slow, lazy circles that seemed to mock his stillness. He reached out to touch the podium, but his hand hovered inches away, trembling. The pride that had fueled his performance for years was draining out of him, replaced by a cold, hollow realization. He looked at his own hands, then back at the vast, dark expanse of the hall. He was the king of a graveyard. Every shadow seemed to lengthen, reaching toward him, pulling at his focus. The air shifted. A microscopic change in the density of the gray vapor triggered a reaction deep within his lungs. Victor took a shallow breath, intending to shout into the void, but the atmosphere turned caustic. It hit his throat like a spray of hot needles. He gasped, his hands flying to his chest. As the first spasm tore through him, he doubled over, his spine arching with the force of the convulsion. A violent, hacking cough erupted from his lungs, echoing against the high ceiling of the ballroom. He clawed at his throat, his face flushing a deep, mottled red as he struggled to draw in clean oxygen. The coughs came in rapid, jagged bursts. He fell to his knees, his palms slamming against the polished stage floor, his vision blurred, the edges of the room spinning into a dark, suffocating haze. He tried to stand, but his body betrayed him, collapsing back into a heap of uncontrolled tremors. Every breath was a struggle against the invisible poison He was no longer a performer. He was a man choking on the very lie he had sold to the world. The composure he had guarded for years disintegrated. The stage floor was cold against his cheek. Victor lay motionless, his chest heaving in shallow, ragged intervals. The violent tremors had subsided, leaving his limbs heavy and unresponsive. He opened his eyes, staring at the dust motes dancing in the dim light. The ballroom was empty. The investors, the celebrities, the string quartet they had all vanished into the night. He tried to speak, to call out for assistance, but his throat was raw and burned. No voice answered. He dragged his hand across the wood, his fingers catching on a splinter, but he felt nothing. The pungent, sulfurous odor remained. He looked toward the exit, but the distance seemed infinite. He was trapped in the center of his own wreckage. The pride that had once defined his every movement had evaporated, leaving a hollow man on a hollow stage. He did not move. He did not try to rise. He simply waited for the darkness to finish what the truth had started. Hours bled into the floorboards. The overhead lights flickered, casting long, erratic shadows across the stage. Victor remained where he had fallen, his gaze fixed on the empty rows of chairs. A heavy door groaned open at the far end of the hall. Footsteps echoed rhythmic, indifferent, and steady. A maintenance crew entered, their movements efficient and devoid of curiosity. They moved through the ballroom, collecting shattered glass and overturned pedestals. One worker walked directly toward the stage, his eyes scanning the floor for debris. He stopped inches from Victor, his boots scuffing the wood, and began sweeping the dust toward the edge. He did not look down. He did not ask if help was needed. To the worker, Victor was simply another piece of refuse to be cleared away. The man reached out, nudged Victor's arm with the tip of his broom, and stepped over him without a word. The indignity was absolute. The silence returned, colder than before, as he finally understood that his empire had vanished, and he had gone with it. The maintenance crew left the ballroom in total darkness. Victor shifted his weight, his palms scraping against the grit left behind on the stage. His hand brushed against something hard and jagged. He pulled his fingers back, but the sharp sting of a cut confirmed the object. It was a shard of the crystal vial. He held it up to the faint moonlight, filtering through the high windows. The glass caught the light, reflecting a distorted, fractured version of his own face. He traced the edge, the pressure drawing a thin line of blood across his skin. He did not flinch. The scent of sulfur had finally begun to fade, replaced by the cold, metallic smell of the empty hall. He realized then that the power he claimed to hold had never been his to command. It was a borrowed light, and now the darkness was absolute. He let the shard fall, the sound of it hitting the floor echoing like a final gavel. He rested his head back against the wood, closing his eyes. There was no grand exit, no dramatic final word, only the slow, steady pulse of his own breathing in the quiet. He was finally settling into the dust. The morning light began to bleed through the high, arched windows, turning the dust motes into tiny, suspended stars. Victor opened his eyes. The ballroom was no longer a place of power, but a hollow shell of wood and velvet. He tried to push himself upright, but his limbs felt heavy, unresponsive, as if the floor itself were pulling him down. He collapsed back against the stage, his breath hitching in the quiet. Outside, the city began to hum. The distant rumble of traffic, the muffled sound of sirens, and the rhythmic beat of a world that had not stopped for his downfall. He looked at his hands, palms stained with the grime of the stage, and saw only the emptiness of his own ambition. The scent of the roses was a ghost, a memory of a lie he had told so often he believed it to be truth. The stage was silent, the hall was empty, and the man who had sought immortality was finally, irrevocably forgotten. The sun climbed higher, casting long, sharp shadows across the floorboards. Victor pushed himself up, his muscles trembling with the effort. He did not look back at the stage. He walked toward the heavy double doors, his footsteps sounding hollow against the polished wood. He pushed the doors open, and the noise of the city rushed in to meet him. It was a roar of indifference. He stepped out onto the sidewalk, blending into the flow of people moving toward the subway. No one looked his way. No one recognized the man who had once held the attention of an entire industry. He felt the cold wind against his skin. He kept his head down, matching his pace to the rhythm of the crowd. Every step took him further from the life he had fabricated. He reached the corner and turned, disappearing into the gray blur of the morning commute. The formula he had stolen was gone. The empire he had built was dust. He was finally free of the lie, but in the process, he had become a ghost in his own life. The world kept turning, and he moved with it, silent and unseen. The city did not care about the fall of an empire. It only cared about the next train, the next meeting, the next hour. Victor walked until his legs burned, moving through the concrete canyons where the sun struggled to reach the pavement. He stopped at a public fountain, the water splashing against the stone with a rhythmic, indifferent pulse. He looked down into the basin, expecting to see the man who had once commanded rooms, but the surface only showed a face stripped of its mask. There was no recognition in the eyes of the commuters who brushed past him. He was no longer a name, no longer a force, just a body occupying space in a world that had already replaced him. He reached out and touched a cold, wet stone, the sensation grounding him. The ambition that had driven him was now a dead weight, a hollow ache in his chest. He turned away from the water and kept walking, merging into the relentless current of the crowd. He was finally invisible, a ghost walking among the living. Far from the noise of the city, Sophie stood in a quiet park, the air crisp and clean. She watched the leaves drift onto the grass, a slow, rhythmic descent that mirrored the settling of her own life. She pulled a stack of papers from her bag, the final, unstable formulas that had brought an empire to its knees. One by one, she tore them into small fragments and let the wind carry them into the fountain. The water caught the scraps, pulling them under until they were nothing but pulp. She did not look back. The obsession that had once consumed her time and energy was gone, replaced by the simple clarity of a new morning. She walked toward the park exit, her stride steady and purposeful. She had learned that the loudest voices are often the most fragile, while the quiet ones hold the true weight of the world. She reached the street, turned, and disappeared into the morning light. The spotlight is a fickle master, demanding constant fuel while offering nothing in return. For those who build, for those who calculate, and for those who labor in the shadows, the truth remains the only currency that never devalues. Sophie understood that the most potent forces are not those that scream for attention, but those that operate beneath the surface, waiting for the precise moment to reveal the structural flaws in a lie. Victor sought the applause of a crowd that would abandon him at the first sign of rot, while Sophie sought only the perfection of her craft. In the end, the stench of ego proved more enduring than any fragrance. The world is full of people who believe they are the architects of their own legend, yet they are often merely the subjects of a much larger, quieter experiment. If this story reminded you that real power was never in the spotlight, it was always in the work, please like and subscribe to Midnight Confessions. The quiet ones are always watching, and we never forget. The screen fades to black, but the lesson remains. True influence does not need an audience to exist. It simply is. The story ends here, but the pattern continues. Every empire built on vanity eventually faces its own internal decay. It is a cycle as old as ambition itself. Those who watch from the periphery see the cracks long before the foundation gives way. They do not need to shout. They do not need to intervene. And they certainly do not need the approval of the crowd. They simply wait for the inevitable shift in the air. You have heard the truth of what happens when the mask slips. Remember that the quietest person in the room is often the one who holds the keys to the entire structure. They are the ones who define the outcome, even when their names are never spoken. Thank you for listening to this account. Keep watching, keep listening. The truth is always waiting just beneath the surface, ready to be uncovered. Until next time, stay observant, stay grounded, and never mistake silence for weakness. The story is finished. The echoes of the gala have long since faded, yet the stench of that failure remains a permanent marker of a hollow legacy. When the lights dim and the applause stops, only the substance of one's actions persists. Sophie moved on, leaving behind the wreckage of a reputation built on nothing but performance. Victor remains in the memory of those who witnessed his downfall, a cautionary figure standing amidst the ruins of his own creation. This is the reality of those who prioritize the image over the craft. They are destined to be consumed by the very illusions they propagate. We hope this account serves as a reminder that the most significant shifts in power occur without fanfare. They happen in the quiet moments of preparation, in the meticulous attention to detail, and in the unwavering commitment to truth. You have seen how a single, unstable formula can dismantle a mountain of arrogance. Carry that perspective with you. Look past the surface of the world around you. Identify the foundations that are truly solid, and recognize the quiet architects who are shaping the future. Our time here is concluded, but the observation continues. The final curtain has fallen on this particular chapter, leaving behind only the cold truth of what was hidden. There is nothing left to add to the account of the gala or the collapse of that hollow empire. The evidence has been presented, the consequences have been realized, and the silence has returned to its rightful place. You have traveled through the deception and witnessed the inevitable correction that follows when substance is ignored. Take this clarity with you as you navigate your own surroundings. Recognize the difference between the noise of the spotlight and the quiet, steady work that actually moves the world. The architects of change rarely seek the stage, yet they are the ones who hold the power to reshape the landscape. As we close this record, remember that the most profound shifts are often the ones that go unnoticed until the air itself changes. We will be waiting in the shadows for the next revelation to surface. Until then, stay observant and keep looking beyond the surface of what you are shown. The narrative cycle is now complete. Every detail of the deception has been laid bare, and the final consequences have settled into history. You have seen how quickly a manufactured image can dissolve when exposed to the reality of genuine craft. There is no more to say regarding the gala or the collapse of that hollow empire. The silence that follows is not empty. It is a space for you to process the truth that was hidden beneath the surface. Carry this lesson forward. Distinguish between the noise of the spotlight and the quiet, steady work that actually moves the world. The architects of change rarely seek the stage, yet they are the ones who hold the power to reshape the landscape. As we close this record, remember that the most profound shifts are often the ones that go unnoticed until the air itself changes. We are finished here, but the world is full of stories waiting for the right eyes to see them. Thank you for your time. The record is now sealed. You have witnessed the full arc of this revelation, from the sterile silence of the laboratory to the chaotic collapse of the gala. What remains is the clarity that only comes after the dust has settled and the truth has been laid bare. There is no more to add to this account. The story has reached its natural conclusion, and the echoes of that final, pungent reality will continue to resonate long after the screen goes dark. Take this perspective with you. Look past the polished surfaces and the manufactured perfection that surrounds you in your daily life. The power dynamics you have seen here are not unique to this narrative. They exist in every room where substance is sacrificed for the sake of an image. Stay vigilant. The quiet ones are always watching, and the work they do is the only foundation that truly holds. We have reached the end of this journey together, but the world remains a vast landscape of hidden truths waiting for the right eyes to uncover them. Thank you for your commitment to this series. Until that moment arrives, keep your observations sharp, your standards unwavering, and your focus fixed on what is real. This is the final word. We are signing off. The final page has been turned. Every revelation has been delivered, and the silence now belongs to you. You have seen how the weight of genuine work inevitably crushes the fragile scaffolding of a lie. There is nothing left to uncover, no further secrets to expose in this particular account. The stage is empty, the lights have dimmed, and the scent of the truth is all that remains. Carry this clarity into your own world. When you encounter the polished, the performative, and the hollow, remember the lesson of the laboratory and the gala. Substance is the only currency that retains its value when the air turns foul. Keep your eyes open, keep your standards firm. This is the conclusion of our time together. We leave you here, in the quiet, with the truth. The series is closed. We are gone. This is the conclusion of our time together. We leave you here, in the quiet, with the truth. The series is closed. We are gone. If this story reminded you that the real power was never in the spotlight, it was always in the work, like and subscribe to the Midnight Confessions. We tell the stories of the underestimated. The quiet ones are watching, and we never forget.